In this chapter, we are going to discuss the role of government and government failure. In the previous chapter, we discussed the fact that markets do fail. They work fairly well most of the time, but in some cases they don't. These are cases where there are public goods or externalities, especially negative externalities. In the case of public goods, markets just simply will not produce the good. In the case of externalities, there are costs imposed upon society that individual companies or individuals do not pay. In that case, government has to intervene. In this chapter, though, we're going to undertake a discussion of what government should do, but also when it fails. For many years, we looked to government to be the solution to the problem, but in more recent years, we began to understand that governments don't always work well, and in fact, they may actually work extremely poorly in many cases. So that's what this chapter is going to be all about. So what is the role of government? Well, one of the advantages government has is they may coerce, and they may coerce in a legal way. Obviously criminals coerce, but that's not a legal way. But in the case of government, they can coerce, and in some cases that's good. For instance, one of the things written in the Constitution is something called eminent domain. That meant that the government could take property after compensating individuals for the sale of that property to use for public uses. And that is a form of coercion, but it is sometimes necessary. For instance, when we were building that railroads across the country, we needed to build them in a straight line. If we had to simply negotiate with every property owner individually, some property owners may not want to sell, and that was going to create a problem. Same with highways and streets and those sort of things. So we do have a right to do that. I might point out that more recently, the Kelo case, which went to the Supreme Court, said governments could basically take property for any reason, even to give it to another developer. That has created a real backlash in many states. In fact, have passed laws that limit the ability of governments to do that. I think it was Lincoln who once said that it is the job of government to do for people what they can't do for themselves. So really, that is exactly what government should do. Given that, we might point out that probably many of the things government does today probably is not really the purview of government, but we do them anyway. Do we, for instance, need to provide Social Security? I'll leave that up to you, but the reality is people can save for their own retirement. What about education? Well, they can provide for education, but they don't necessarily need to produce it. So they can do it in different ways, and so we'll talk about some of those in this chapter. So what are some of the problems of directing and managing government? Well, for one thing, government's extremely large, and there's really problems of accountability in government. The other is, as we point out, the first thing is there's no invisible hand. There's no profit motive. There's no price motive. And we don't have the normal sorts of controls of government we would in the market. For instance, when companies make bad decisions, they lose money and they may well go broke. When government makes bad decisions, they just simply either go out and borrow the money or they tax the individuals. So there's really no invisible hand. The other problem is that politicians really don't have, as they say, any skin in the game. If they make bad decisions, oh well, they make bad decisions and you and I have to pay for it. They're also very large. Federal government's grown to be immense. It's literally uncontrollable. There are many programs that are actually undertaken in many different agencies, and they don't even know about those programs. As government gets larger, trying to get information about the government seems to be more difficult because even the government doesn't understand what it's doing. The third is bureaucracy. What does that mean? Well, bureaucracy sort of creates a wall against getting things done in most cases. Yes, sometimes we need bureaucracy, but in many cases they simply slow the process down. For instance, in the state of California, it can take well over a year to get permits to open a business. In other states, it may take a matter of days. That's simply bureaucracy at work. And you may say, well, there are good reasons for that. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Part of the problem is bureaucracy doesn't work very fast, and there's no incentive for it to work very fast. We often joke about the Department of Motor Vehicles, and do we really want our businesses run by it like that? Well, it's a joke of sorts, but it is an extremely good question. There's a lot of need for paperwork, and there's very inflexible. Paperwork is always necessary. So it's funny how the government actually has something called the Paperwork Reduction Act, and what they do is actually ask you to fill out a form to help them reduce paperwork. Strange, isn't it? And they're also very inflexible. They have rules that simply cannot be broken. They follow these rules, and it literally takes, in some cases, we say, an act of Congress. I remember I was spent 8 years on the Davenport City Council, and we had one particular incident came up. A lady wanted to start basically a transportation service for individuals. Well, the problem is the way we had written our ordinance, she had some driving infractions, and we couldn't give it to her. And everybody on the council felt absolutely awful about it. We actually changed the ordinance. By then, she had moved on to other things. We simply were bound by our own rules that had been created. More recently, the state of Illinois, even though they're pretty much broke, tried to change their retirement program for state workers, and the Supreme Court informed them they couldn't do it because they had written all of this into the Constitution. So they're going to have to change the Constitution, probably in order to save the state from financial ruin. There's also a problem of information aggregation. In other words, we put all this information together, and it gives us kind of an average of things, but it doesn't really tell us much. So what we end up doing is we make the same rules for a place like Los Angeles and New York as we do for Wheatland, Iowa, even though those are extremely different places. When I grew up, the way you got rid of your trash was you took it to some farmer. He probably had a big hole in the ground he wanted to fill, and you dumped it there. The state stopped them. What ended up happening is the county had no landfill. The rules and regulations were so strict that there simply was too expensive for the county to have a landfill anywhere, and there were only about 15,000 people in the county. So what happened? Probably people just dumped it alongside the road. There's also a lack of accountability. We've seen this repeatedly in the case of the IRS and the Veterans Administration. We know things are not done properly, but nobody is ever fired, and nobody is ever taken to task. They're usually given paid administrative leave, which is like giving somebody a vacation for doing something wrong. Now, government fails for many reasons. Many of these are very typical of any kind of a large organization. But one of the big problems you have is the problem of democracy itself. There's a great paradox in democracy. Democracy really says that we should do what the majority of the people want. That's kind of a populist approach. It doesn't really make any difference if it's sound or anything else. A true democracy would simply do what people want the government to do. I might point out, though, we don't really have a democracy in the United States. We have a republic, and that is definitely different. It's a representative form of government. So we elect representatives, send them to Congress. Is that better? I don't know. But let me give you a paradox of democracy situation. Let's assume you had a true democracy. What happens if 50% plus one of the population decides to murder the other 49% of the population? Technically, that's a democratic decision. Does it make any sense? Of course not. But in theory, it really works. And in fact, in some countries, it's actually happened. We know that. There's also the problem of democracy and the principal agent problem. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, this happens in large corporations, too. We buy stock in a company. In this case, we live in a country, and we pay taxes. And we hire people to undertake problem solutions for us. And so what we assume is those principals acting as our agents will solve those problems well. Well, guess what? They don't always. And often they do it in their best interest instead of our best interest. And so we see that. In fact, just recently, within the last week, something has been published called the Panama Papers, where some information came out of a law firm in Panama showing that many leaders of many of our countries are hiding money and income in tax haven countries. Strange. They impose taxes on us and then they hide their money from the taxes. Well, they're obviously not operating in our best interest. There's also what we call the special interest effect. And quite honestly, this seems to have grown, and probably the reason that some people running for office today have gotten a lot of support. What does this mean? Well, people go to Washington and they ask politicians for special favors. And what this does is it gives them this is what we call the special interest effect. Pass a law for us, or give us a tax break you don't give other people. Well, that's a special interest effect. And this seems to have grown demonstrably over the last several years. For instance, the income tax laws are so complicated, nobody knows them all. They're several thousand pages long, but in those there are several carve-outs for special interest groups. Some of those you may belong to. We allow interest deductions for houses. Isn't that really a special interest effect? The answer is yes, it is. Most of us, but we need that. And it's like, well, maybe yes and maybe no, but on the other hand, economists would tell you that allowing people to deduct interest on houses actually makes houses more costly. It actually drives up the price of housing. And then there's something called rent-seeking behavior. And that's very similar to the special interest effect, but we give certain groups special rules that others don't have. For instance, licensing of certain professions is often a rent-seeking behavior. For instance, in the state of Iowa, and the ordinances and the laws on plumbing are much stricter than they are on electrical work. Why? Well, that's rent-seeking behavior. I would guess probably the plumbing lobby is stronger than the electrician's lobby. And trying to get an answer as to why that happens is absolutely impossible. Many years ago, I owned a bakery in the state of Illinois, and I always said if I were smart, what I would do is I would go to the state legislature, require that all bakers had to be licensed and go through special training. Of course, since I already had a bakery, they wouldn't require me to do that because I would be grandfathered in. That would make it very, very difficult for people to compete with me. In one state, I believe it was New Jersey, black women were doing hair braiding. They were then informed by the state that they had to go to cosmetology school. Here's the problem. Cosmetology school doesn't teach that. So if they wanted to continue to operate, they would have to go to cosmetology school, pay for courses that doesn't really do them any good to be able to continue to do that. Now, why do we call that rent-seeking behavior? Because I'm sure the cosmetology schools were the ones who really wanted that, and so it would keep people from competing against them. So in many cases, a lot of the ordinances and laws we pass actually are just a way to allow certain groups to impose higher prices on us. What are the other problems with government? Well, one's clear benefits and hidden costs. It's always easy to see at least the initial benefit of doing something. But then there are all kinds of hidden costs. For instance, I mentioned the fact that we allow people to deduct the interest paid on their homes as a tax deduction. Result, higher prices of homes. Sounds great. It's really going to help us, but does it really? At least two recent studies put out by the Cato Institution have made a point of this. One is on the cost of higher education. They've generally found that what has happened is most of the federal dollars that have been put into student aid have simply gone to pay a higher tuition cost. Probably those tuition costs would not be nearly as high today as they are if it hadn't been for federal aid. The other one, even more interestingly, is the fact that the poverty program has actually increased the amount of poverty. By actually giving people too many benefits, they've encouraged people not to get off the program and really kept them in poverty. Second are unfunded liabilities. Government doesn't have to keep books the way private companies do. For instance, some years ago, the Accounting Standards Board said to companies, look, if you're going to give people free health care after they retire, you have to estimate the present value of that. Government does not need to do that. And early in the course, I showed you something called the U.S. debt clock. The unfunded liabilities of the United States are about $100 trillion. That's just the federal government. Those are absolutely impossible for us to ever pay. But it's very easy for government to do that because they don't have to carry that on their books as a liability. They simply ignore it completely. The other is chronic budget deficits. Well, with macroeconomics that some of you had, some of you will take, we would be saying today that if in fact we have full employment, which we keep being told we do, that we should have a balanced budget. In fact, quite the contrary, we have a $500 billion deficit, and it's supposed to grow even if the economy gets better. So that means that we have actually have continuing deficits when in fact we really should have balanced budgets for policy purposes. So all this means is the government's spending a lot of money that it should not be spending and probably having a negative impact on the economy. The other is misdirection of stabilization policy. We should be doing certain things and we're doing exactly the opposite because of this. Again, I go back to the point I made a minute ago that if in fact we are at full employment, many people would argue a 5% unemployment rate is pretty close to full employment, that again we should have a balanced budget. We don't. So we're really not having proper fiscal policy in the federal government. And then what that has done is it's required or really forced the Federal Reserve to do things they should not be doing. Zero interest rates make no sense. Some countries have even gone to negative interest rates, and that makes even less sense. But because of this misdirection of policy, we have serious problems, and probably the long-term impact is going to be highly negative. We also have limited and bundled choices. Now, what does that mean? Well, we can't decide everything. One of the problems so often in government is we pass a law, which is for the rule, not the exception. Then some story comes out about somebody who was harmed by this or didn't get covered by it properly, and all of a sudden we're trying to make a law or an ordinance that not only covers the general situation, it tries to cover the specific situation. This is absolutely impossible. You can't make rules that do that. They can't cover every possibility. The other is we have bundled choices. When we vote for an individual, we may agree with 2/3 of what he says and disagree with the other 1/3, but yet we have to either vote for or against that person. So bundled choices are a problem. Also, the way federal government, especially the Congress, does things is they pass bills that have things in them that we like, but also many things they don't. We have riders that are attached to bills that require government to spend money in areas that they shouldn't. Some years ago, under the Clinton administration, we passed a big bill to help law enforcement and to help crime. Included in that was several $1 million, or it could have been $1 billion for child care. Now, why was that there? Somebody just stuck it in the bill. You can do that, and it happens all the time. They've tried to stop it, but it simply isn't going to be stopped. Also, bureaucracies are inefficient. They take too much time to make decisions, and they often make, and that's really the biggest problem. In the world of private business, time is extremely important. In the world of government, it's of no value at all. What should take a matter of days or weeks takes a matter of years. Again, I point out that when I was on the city council, I found out just how slowly things could move. One of the things I tried to get the city to do, and I said any good company would do, is to develop a strategic plan. After 3 years, we finally decided to develop a strategic plan. Any company of any value whatsoever would have probably done that the first month of business or before they actually went into business. In government, it's almost impossible. And by the way, most governments don't have a strategic plan, I found out. What are the other problems of government intervention? Well, one's inefficient regulation and intervention. They make rules that really don't make any sense. They really have very little value. If you try to harken back to what we've said earlier in the course, we talk about marginal costs and marginal benefits. Oftentimes, government passes regulation that literally have no benefits whatsoever, but there are definitely marginal costs that government has to pay. And, they just simply don't make any sense. And I've seen this many times with many of our regulations. Having studied regulations, which was one of my specialty areas, the more you study regulation, the more you realize it just doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is simply because government just doesn't do it right. And And so they intervene where they shouldn't. For instance, today there are rules on the size of print required for dog food bags. One of my favorite stories is the fact that when we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, the government was actually going to require McDonald's and the fast food places to put their menu at the drive-up window in Braille. They finally kind of realized that really didn't make any sense because there were not a lot of blind people driving. So they did rescind it finally, but in many cases they simply make requirements. Many years ago I worked at a laboratory and OSHA came in and inspected, and they required us to make all these changes. One was they decided the fire extinguisher was too low and it needed to have these lines behind it indicating it was a fire extinguisher. I think most of us realized it was. But it was too low. We had to raise it about a foot, and then we had to put this special symbol behind it and paint that on there. But the ironic part was, at no point did they ever say you have to have something in the fire extinguisher. And it wasn't very clear that we did have. But at least we had the right sign behind it. So in regulation, with regulation, several things happen. Number one, we have something called capture theory. We actually begin to regulate an industry, and pretty soon the industry and the government agency that are regulating them are sort of in cahoots together. The government realizes, the agency realizes that if they destroy that industry, that they no longer have a job. So they're very careful to work very carefully with that group they're regulating. Now, I'm not saying that's all bad, but there's simply a pipeline of people from government into those corporations. A few years working for the government, pretty soon you've got a job with the company you've been regulating. This was well known, for instance, in the regulation of the trucking and the railroads. Actually, in the beginning, the idea was that they wanted a government agency to control trucking because they had all the power. With time, the trucking industry got all the power, and then they started to make decisions that were very adverse for the railroads, and probably good for no consumers at all. They also make poor choices for government investment. You know, politicians are not really investment people. They should never do investments. They simply haven't good decision-making process. They look at all the wrong things. They're not experts at looking at balance sheets and income statements and whether the company is going to succeed or not. But in fact, the government does make investments. I know in Davenport there have been several really bad investments by the city over the years. In the case of the federal government, it's rampant. They invested $500 million in a company called Solyndra for solar panels. A few months later, the company filed bankruptcy. Why did they give a loan like that? Well, quite bluntly, the owner of Solyndra had been a big donor to the president. What about loan guarantees? Well, we make loan guarantees, and we make loan guarantees for people that probably we shouldn't. Perfect example, in 2008, the big meltdown was because we had guaranteed some of these loans. And we guarantee them for companies and everything, and often we guarantee them with very little forethought. So some of those, liabilities we've talked about, those unfunded liabilities are really loan guarantees. If companies go broke, the government has guaranteed those loans, and the taxpayer is going to get to pay for them. Also, there's corruption. The bigger government gets, the more corrupt it gets. The problem is the laws become so immense. There are so many laws and so many regulations, nobody knows them all. And so, therefore, the government workers can take advantage of that. I can and won't do it here, but I will probably talk about it a little bit in class. Some of the things that I know had happened in the city of Davenport, and we know they happen other places. The city of Chicago, which has been classed as the most corrupt city in America, has people on the payroll who never come to work. They just get paid. They also have people who vote that don't really live there. It's well known that, for years, and I don't know if it's still true, dead people were voting in Chicago. So corruption is a real big part of government. In governments in countries where the government has a lot of control, paying off government officials is just part of getting things done. You can't get anything done unless you do. And then finally is their unwillingness to change. Governments don't like to change. I've often argued that any bureaucratic organization, not just government, any bureaucratic organization, over the long run, their major goal will be not to change. Well, government's the same way. They really try to stop change. They don't try to initiate change. Because of that, it really slows down progress, because change is absolutely critical for progress. The problem is, things that are better don't have any constituency. For instance, we look at the Food and Drug Administration as protecting us, but the problem is it takes so long to bring many of those drugs to market, many that could save lives, that by the time we get done with all the testing, many of the people that could have been helped are dead. There have been proposed changes to that. For instance, if I have 6 months to live and it's going to take the government 5 years to okay this drug, I should be able to go in, sign a waiver of liability for the government and be allowed to use that. Right now you can't do that. You're just supposed to die. So government is unwilling